The concrete rose and the scissors. This is a response, to a letter from the Guardian news paper, the Iran letter. One angry black MAGA general, the poet of rage. I read the Guardian's open letter to Iran's political prisoners, and I found myself staring at something larger than Iran. I was staring at the unfinished business of the American black radical imagination. The letter, signed by figures including Angela Davis, Umia Abu Jamal, Judith Butler, Rashid Khalidi, Robin D.G. Kelly, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, describe Iranian prisoners as caught between two blades of a scissors. Repression by the Islamic Republican on one side and American Israeli military power on the other. It demands that Iran stop executions and free political prisoners while simultaneously demanding an end to U.S. and Israeli military action and sanctions. That is a serious argument, but I think there is another question that the letter unintentionally exposes. What happens when an ideology becomes so committed to yesterday's oppressor that it cannot recognize today's possibility? That is the question I would put, to my people, and frankly to myself. The old map, the original Black Panther analysis emerged from a particular America. Huey P. Newton and the Panthers confronted a nation in which black people were systematically excluded from political and economic power, and where the state itself could be an instrument of racial repression. That history cannot be erased, but history is not supposed to become a prison. An analysis designed to explain one historical moment can become inadequate when the conditions change. This is where I believe contemporary black activism sometimes makes its greatest intellectual mistake. It continues looking at America through the eyes of 1968, while America is standing in 2026. That does not mean racism disappeared. It means the American story became more complicated. And perhaps the most uncomfortable possibility for some black radicals is this: perhaps some white Americans actually changed. The concrete rose. Tupac gave us one of the most brilliant metaphors in modern black poetry. The rose that grew from concrete. The miracle isn't that the rose survived. The miracle is that something beautiful emerged from something that was never supposed to be allowed to grow. I want to extend that metaphor. America was once concrete. Slavery was concrete. Jim Crow was concrete. Segregation was concrete. Lynching was concrete. Racial exclusion was concrete. And white America participated in building much of that concrete. And, but history is strange. Sometimes even the people who inherit the sins of their ancestors can begin breaking the concrete, generation by generation, law by law, child by child, conscience by conscience. And eventually a rose appears. I believe Donald Trump may represent something that the old black radical framework has difficulty recognizing. A white American political movement that does not fit comfortably inside the racial assumptions of the past. That does not mean Trump is perfect. It does not mean racism vanished. It does not mean every Trump supporter is enlightened. It means that racial politics cannot remain intellectually frozen forever. And this is where Iran gets interesting. The Trump administration's stated objectives in its Iran campaign have centered on destroying Iran's missile and military capabilities, preventing it from obtaining a nuclear weapon, and cutting its support for terrorist proxies. But Washington's Iran policy has also explicitly included support for Iranian dissidents and political prisoners. U.S. law itself establishes a policy of supporting efforts to identify prisoners of conscience and publicly calling for the release of Iranian dissidents and prisoners of conscience. And on August 24th, the White House announced Operation Economic Outcast, describing its objective as isolating the Iranian regime economically and leaving Tehran facing a choice between isolation and returning to the global economy. Now here is my Hail Mary. And yes, I deliberately use that phrase because I am Catholic. What if the long game is bigger than the bomb? What if Trump's strategy is not merely destroy Iran's military capacity? What if the ultimate strategy is create conditions in which the Iranian people themselves can determine what comes next? I cannot prove that this is Trump's hidden master plan. The administration's published military objectives do not explicitly say we are bombing Iran so Iranian political prisoners can overthrow the government. In fact, it stated objectives have been more narrowly framed around nuclear weapons, missiles, military capabilities, and terrorism. But I can say this: it is entirely legitimate to ask whether regime pressure and support for dissidents are components of a broader strategy. That possibility deserves intellectual examination rather than automatic dismissal. The contradiction, and that brings me back to The Guardian. The letter says Iranian prisoners are caught between two blades. Fine, but perhaps there is another way to see the scissors. One blade is authoritarianism. The other is the ideology that became so suspicious of American power that it cannot imagine American power being used for liberation. That is where I part company with the old analysis. Because if you believe that every American exercise of power must ultimately be imperialism, then you have constructed an ideology that cannot recognize liberation when it arrives wearing an American uniform. And that is precisely where I believe some contemporary black activists have become trapped. The capitalism of activism. There is also a class dimension that deserves examination. Radicalism can become a career. Resistance can become an institution. Anti-capitalism can become a publishing industry. Revolution can become a university department. The language of liberation can become professional capital. And once revolutionary identity becomes a form of social capital, changing one's mind becomes expensive. That doesn't mean every activist is fraudulent. Far from it. But intellectual movements are human institutions, and human beings can become financially, socially, and psychologically invested in their own worldview. Sometimes the most profitable thing a revolutionary can sell is the revolution itself. Now listen, how can these people possibly trust America? I understand the question. I ask another. How can we refuse to acknowledge when America changes? If Archie Bunker can become a cultural object whose bigotry is presented to the audience as absurdity, and All in the Family deliberately used him to explore the contradictions and ugliness of prejudice, then popular culture itself was participating in a national argument about whether racism should be understood as normal or pathological. America was arguing with itself, and eventually America changed. Not completely, not perfectly, but substantially. That's the point. A more perfect union is not a finished union. The Black Panther question. Even Huey Newton's legacy deserves more complexity than mythology sometimes permits. If, my man himself now believes that armed revolution was problematic, then something profound has already happened. He has revised the framework. That's not betrayal, that's intellectual maturity. The Black Panther Party, who studied yesterday's America, cannot be allowed to become a theological prophet whose conclusions cannot be questioned today. Newton was a man, not Moses. And if the historical circumstances change, our analysis must change with them. The rose has grown. This is why I return to Tupac. The concrete rose does not deny the concrete. It grows through it. I don't believe America should be judged only by what it once was. I believe America should also be judged by what it is becoming. And perhaps that is what I see in Trump that some of my black brothers and sisters cannot yet see. I see a political movement that has disrupted traditional racial alignments. I see black Americans who have decided that their political future cannot be permanently inherited from their grandparents. And I see a president who has chosen confrontation with Iran while simultaneously operating within a long-standing American policy framework that supports Iranian dissidents and political prisoners. Whether Trump's Iran strategy ultimately liberates anyone remains an open historical question. The war is ongoing, public support has fallen, and the administration itself faces criticism over its strategy. So I will not pretend the Hail Mary has already landed. The ball is still in the air. But I refuse to believe that history ended in 1968. And I refuse to believe that every white American is permanently imprisoned inside the racial consciousness of America's past. The slave master was once concrete. The segregationist was once concrete. The racial or the racist was once concrete. And even concrete can crack. And sometimes through those cracks, a rose grows. Maybe that rose is Donald Trump. Maybe it isn't. History will decide. But if we refuse even to consider the possibility, then the prison we inherited from the past has become the prison we choose for ourselves. And that, my brothers and sisters, would be the ultimate contradiction. The poet of rage has learned something. Liberation requires not only the courage to remember who oppressed us, but the courage to recognize who may be helping us become free. One angry black MAGA general calling out.